You're walking along a bridge on a cold November night when you hear a splash. Someone has just jumped into the river below. You freeze. You do nothing, but eventually you walk away. Years later, this moment haunts you so deeply that you descend into your own personal hell, confessing your sins to strangers in a seedy Amsterdam bar. This isn't fiction. Well, it is. But it's also the story of how one of the 20th century's greatest thinkers wrestled with guilt, innocence, and what it means to be human. Today, we're talking about Albert Camus. And yes, we're talking about his rise and his fall, but maybe not in the way you think. Albert Camus was born on November 7th, 1913, in a tiny village called Mondovi in French Algeria. If you're picturing a comfortable childhood filled with books and intellectual conversations, think again. Camus' father Lucien was a wine-shipping clerk and military veteran. When Albert was less than a year old, World War I broke out, but his father was recalled to service. On October 11th, 1914, Lucien Camus died from shrapnel wounds at the First Battle of the Marne. About the only thing young Albert would ever learn about his father was that he once became violently ill after witnessing a public execution. This detail would stick with Camus for life and fuel his passionate opposition to the death penalty. After his father's death, Camus, his mother Catherine, and his older brother moved to Algiers to live with their grandmother in her cramped second-floor apartment in the working-class district of Belcourt. Catherine Camus was illiterate, partially deaf, and had a speech impediment. She worked in an ammunition factory and cleaned homes to support the family. But here's the thing about young Albert. He had a light inside him that poverty couldn't dim. At the local elementary school, a teacher named Louis Germain recognized this light. He became the first in a series of father figures who would introduce Camus to a world beyond the dusty streets of Belcourt. These mentors opened doors to history, imagination, and literature that would transform the boy labeled a pupille de la nation, a war veteran's child dependent on public welfare, into one of the 20th century's most important voices. In high school, Camus devoured books. He read Gide, Proust, Verlaine, and Bergson. He learned Latin and English. He discovered theatre and film, and he fell in love with soccer, playing as a goalkeeper, which taught him, as he later wrote, that a ball never arrives from the direction you expected it. But then tuberculosis struck. This disease would haunt him throughout his life, attacking him repeatedly, derailing his plans, and ultimately preventing him from pursuing an academic career. Yet even this couldn't stop him. By 1933, Camus had enrolled at the University of Algiers, studying philosophy while working odd jobs to survive. It was during these soul-crushing routines that something began to take shape in his imagination. What if life itself was like pushing a rock up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down, then having to push it up again, forever? What if that absurd struggle was the human condition? In 1936, Camus co-founded the Théâtre du Travail, an acting company specializing in left-wing political drama. He acted, directed, and wrote scripts. That same year, he completed his university degree and his dissertation, which explored how the ancient philosopher Plotinus influenced St. Augustine. He was a young man from poverty, raised by an illiterate mother, now swimming in the deep waters of Western philosophy and Christian thought. But Camus himself, he was never a believer. Even as he studied Augustine, even as he would later show deep respect for Christianity in his writing, Camus was a natural-born pagan. He loved the sun, the sea, the physical world. His early writings from this period, collected in Nuptials and Betwixt and Between, celebrate exactly this: the beauty of the physical world, the pleasure of being alive in your body, the glory of the present moment. But these aren't just pretty nature poems, they're philosophical statements. Camus was saying something radical, that life is enough, that this world with all its beauty and pain is sufficient, that hoping for an afterlife actually cheapens the life we have now. He wrote, "The world is beautiful, and outside there is no salvation." He insisted that believing in life after death makes us stop truly living the life we have. He called hope an evil because it teaches us to look away from the present, towards some imagined future that may never come. Now you might be wondering, what's so philosophical about enjoying sunshine and swimming in the Mediterranean? Well, Camus was building towards something bigger. He was asking, if there's no God, no afterlife, no ultimate meaning to existence, then why not just end it all? Why live? This question would become the opening line of his breakthrough philosophical essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. There is only one really serious philosophical question. and that is suicide. By this time, it's 1942, and the world has gone mad. World War II is raging. France is occupied by Nazi Germany. Camus has married his second wife Francine and moved between Algeria and France. He's suffering from tuberculosis again, struggling to make ends meet, teaching part-time at a private school. And then, in June 1942, his first novel is published. The Stranger opens with one of the most famous lines in modern literature: "Mother died today." Or maybe yesterday, I can't be sure. The narrator, Meursault, is a man who seems to observe his own life from the outside, emotionally detached from everything, even his own mother's death. He kills an Arab man on a beach, almost by accident, distracted by the sun. He's arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. The novel made Camus famous almost overnight. 4 months later, The Myth of Sisyphus appeared. Here Camus laid out his philosophy of the absurd. What is the absurd? It's the conflict between our human need for meaning, order, and understanding, and the universe's total silence on these matters. We're like Sisyphus from Greek mythology, condemned by the gods to push a rock up a mountain forever. Every time he reaches the top, the rock rolls back down, and he has to start again. That's us. We search for meaning in a meaningless universe. We demand answers from a cosmos that doesn't care. We want to live forever, but we know we'll die. This tension, this mismatch between what we want and what we get, that's the absurd. Now, most people, when faced with this absurdity, choose one of two paths. First, they might commit actual physical suicide. If life has no meaning, why bother living? Camus rejects this as cowardly. Second, they might commit what he calls philosophical suicide by embracing religion or some other belief system that promises meaning. They invent an afterlife, or they dedicate themselves to a grand cause, or they convince themselves that science will explain everything. Camus rejects this too, calling it dishonest escapism. So what's left? Camus says we must accept the absurd. We must embrace it. We must live fully, consciously, rebelliously, without hope of ultimate meaning, without consolation. We must be like Sisyphus, who, knowing his task is pointless, pushes the rock up anyway. This philosophy wasn't just academic theory for Camus. By 1943, he'd become active in the French resistance, working for the underground newspaper Combat. He was risking his life fighting actual Nazis, all while his tuberculosis flared up again and again. After the liberation in 1944, he became Combat's editor-in-chief. He was no longer just a novelist and philosopher. He was a voice of moral authority, speaking out on the urgent questions of his time. Should France execute Nazi collaborators? Camus said no, opposing the death penalty even for those who'd betrayed their country. When America dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, Camus was one of the very few public figures to immediately condemn it. In 1947, Camus published his second novel, The Plague. Set in the Algerian city of Oran, it tells the story of a mysterious plague that closes off the city from the outside world. The residents must band together, forming sanitary squads to fight the disease, even though they know their efforts might be futile. Everyone understood this was an allegory for the Nazi occupation of France. The plague represented fascism, and the sanitary squads represented the resistance. But it was more than that. The plague represented the absurd itself, the random suffering that life throws at us. The characters don't fight the plague because they think they'll win. They fight it because fighting is the right thing to do. They act in solidarity with each other, performing their duties without heroics, without grand gestures, just doing the work that needs doing. And this brings us to Camus' second great philosophical work, The Rebel, published in 1951. If The Myth of Sisyphus asked, why not commit suicide? The Rebel asks, why not commit murder? This might sound strange, but remember the times Camus was living through. The 20th century had become an era of mass murder on an industrial scale. The Holocaust, Stalin's purges, Hiroshima, revolutionary movements around the world embracing violence in the name of justice. Camus wanted to understand how murder had become, as he put it, reasonable and theoretically defensible. The Rebel starts from that same sense of absurdity we've already discussed, but now Camus explores what happens when individual absurdist rebellion turns into collective revolutionary action. He traces a history of revolt, from the Greeks through Christianity, through the French Revolution, through 19th century nihilism, up to modern totalitarian movements, especially communism. His argument was controversial then and remains so now. He claimed that revolutionary movements, particularly Marxism and communism, were just another form of religion. They promised a paradise on earth, a future where all suffering would end, where justice would finally reign. And in the name of that imagined future paradise, they justified murdering people in the present. Hundreds of thousands dead? That's just the price of progress. We're building utopia. We're serving history with a capital H. Camus said no, absolutely not. He argued that the moment you start killing people to create your perfect world, you've betrayed the very principle of rebellion. True rebellion begins when someone says, "No, thus far and no further. I have dignity and so do you." Rebellion recognizes that there's a common human nature, that we're all in this absurd situation together, and that we have solidarity with each other. The rebel fights oppression, but the rebel also recognizes limits. You cannot fight for human dignity by treating humans as disposable. You cannot rebel against death by embracing murder. Revolution, in Camus's view, always betrays rebellion because it sacrifices present human beings for an abstract future that may never arrive. This put Camus on a collision course with the dominant left-wing intellectuals of his time, including his friend Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre and many others had decided that communism, despite its flaws, was the best hope for human liberation. They believed history had a direction, that revolution was necessary, that you couldn't make an omelette without breaking eggs. Camus, who'd actually been a Communist Party member briefly in the 1930s, now stood against this. He was accused of being a reactionary, a bourgeois moralist, someone who refused to face the hard realities of political struggle. His friendship with Sartre ended bitterly in 1952 after a vicious public dispute. It became one of the defining intellectual feuds of the 20th century. Camus on one side arguing for limits, for moral restraint, for living in the present, for human solidarity, and Sartre on the other, arguing for historical necessity, for revolutionary commitment, for a future-oriented politics. But here's what makes this so painful. Camus understood the revolutionary impulse. He sympathized with it. He'd seen poverty, oppression, and injustice up close his entire life. He wasn't a conservative defending the status quo. He was a rebel, arguing that there are better and worse ways to rebel, that some forms of rebellion preserve our humanity while others destroy it. He knew that violence is sometimes inevitable, that the oppressed cannot always turn the other cheek, but he insisted that violence must be exceptional, limited, direct, and the person who commits it must be willing to sacrifice their own life in return. You cannot casually order mass executions from a comfortable office and claim to be fighting for justice. True. Throughout the 1950s, Camus continued writing and speaking out. He adapted Dostoevsky's plays for the stage. He wrote essays. He agonized over Algeria, his homeland, which was now erupting into violent revolution as the native Muslim population fought for independence from France. Camus, a European Algerian himself, hoped desperately for some kind of peaceful solution where Arabs and French settlers could live together. He knew his hopes were probably futile, but he couldn't abandon them. When people demanded he take a clear stance, supporting either French colonial rule or the revolutionary independence movement, he said something that would be quoted and misquoted forever. "I believe in justice, but I will defend my mother before justice." People attacked him for this, accusing him of putting family loyalty above moral principle. But what Camus meant was more complicated. He was saying that abstract political causes, no matter how just they seem, should never make us forget the real human beings in front of us, the individuals whose faces we know, whose lives matter to us personally. And then, in 1956, Camus published his final completed novel, a slim, elegant book called The Fall. This is where we return to that opening image, the person jumping off the bridge. The Fall is narrated by a man named Jean-Baptiste Clements, which roughly translates to John the Baptist Clemency, a voice crying out for forgiveness. He's a former lawyer who once thought of himself as a good person. He defended the poor, he lived morally, he was admired. But one night, walking home through Paris, he heard a woman jump from a bridge into the Seine River. He did nothing. He kept walking. And that moment of inaction, that failure of basic human sympathy, destroyed him. The book is his confession delivered in an Amsterdam bar to a silent stranger who might as well be us, the readers. Clements has descended into what he calls his personal hell. He's become a judge penitent, someone who judges himself while judging everyone else. He tells his story as both confession and accusation, because if he's guilty, then so is everyone. None of us have clean hands, we're all complicit, we all fail each other, we all walk past drowning people. And yet Clements insists this means none of us have the right to judge others. How can we condemn anyone when we're all guilty? The Fall is often read as Camus's response to his critics, particularly Sartre and other former friends who'd accused him of moral cowardice and political failure. It's Clements who's the coward, who fails to act when action is needed. But Clements is also everyone, including Camus himself. The book is a meditation on guilt and innocence, on the gap between who we think we are and who we actually are when tested. It's about the impossibility of moral purity in a world where every choice involves compromise. Unlike the relatively clear moral universe of the plague, where the duty to fight the pestilence is obvious, The Fall shows us a murkier world where the right action isn't clear, where even our good deeds might be tainted by vanity and selfishness, where the person who failed to save a drowning stranger might be just as representative of humanity as the person who joins the sanitary squads. Many critics consider The Fall Camus's most sophisticated work, the most complex in its moral vision, the most psychologically subtle. It's shorter than his other novels, almost a long monologue, but it's dense with meaning. And here's where the wordplay of our title reveals itself. We've been talking about Camus's rise, his journey from poverty to literary fame to the Nobel Prize, and we've been building toward his fall. But his fall isn't a collapse or a failure. His fall is this book. The Fall, his artistic triumph, his most mature meditation on the human condition. The fall in The Fall is our fall, humanity's fall from innocence, from the illusion of moral purity. It's the fall into self-awareness, into acknowledging our guilt, our complicity, our shared condition. And paradoxically, this fall is also a kind of rise, because only by facing our guilt honestly can we move forward with any integrity. In 1957, Camus was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature at age 44, one of the youngest writers ever to receive it. The Nobel Committee cited his efforts to illuminate the problem of the human conscience in our time. Camus was grateful, but also uncomfortable. He felt his friend André Malraux deserved it more. He worried the prize was the kind of thing you get at the end of a career, and he considered his own work still in progress. He said in his acceptance speech that he was a man almost young, rich only in his doubts, with his work still developing. He couldn't have known how prophetic those words were. On January 4, 1960, Albert Camus died in a car accident. He was just 46 years old. His friend and publisher Michel Gallimard was driving. Both men died from their injuries. In Camus' briefcase they found the manuscript of an unfinished autobiographical novel called The First Man, which would be published decades later. Jean-Paul Sartre, despite their bitter feud, wrote a moving tribute, acknowledging Camus' courage, his stubborn humanism, his moral seriousness in the face of massive historical forces. It was one of the most generous acts of Sartre's life, honouring a friend who'd become an enemy but who'd never stopped mattering. So what's the legacy of Albert Camus? What does he have to teach us today? First, there's his philosophy of the absurd, which remains one of the 20th century's most powerful descriptions of the modern human condition. We live in a world without inherent meaning, without cosmic purpose, without divine guarantees. That's not comfortable, but it's not cause for despair either. We can choose to live fully, intensely, consciously, embracing life precisely because it's finite and fragile. The struggle itself is enough. Second, there's his philosophy of rebellion and his critique of revolutionary violence. In an age when political movements, both left and right, often embrace absolute certainty and justify terrible means by their supposedly noble ends, Camus reminds us that there are limits. Human solidarity is more important than any ideology. Real people matter more than historical abstractions. Justice pursued without limits becomes injustice. The rebel must maintain moral consistency, must recognize that every human being has dignity, even enemies and oppressors. This doesn't mean passivity or accepting oppression. It means fighting for justice without becoming what you're fighting against. Third, there's his style, his way of writing that manages to be both simple and profound, hard-boiled and lyrical, clear and mysterious. He wrote about the biggest questions, life and death, meaning and absurdity, good and evil, but he wrote in language that ordinary people could understand. He created characters we remember, Meursault walking to his execution, Sisyphus pushing his rock, Dr. Ria organizing sanitary squads, Clamence confessing in his Amsterdam bar. These aren't just fictional creations, they're ways of being human, different responses to the absurd situation we all share. Fourth, and maybe most importantly, there's Camus' example of how to live with full awareness of life's contradictions without becoming cynical. He faced the absurd without flinching. He acknowledged that we're all guilty, all flawed, all compromised, and yet he never stopped believing in human dignity, in justice, in the possibility of acting well. He was a pessimist who somehow avoided despair. He was a non-believer who wrote with almost religious intensity. He was a rebel who insisted on Lyran's. He was a man who saw the worst of human nature, who lived through war and occupation and political violence, who watched his hopes for Algeria collapse, who suffered illness and poverty and bitter public feuds. And yet he still found reasons to imagine Sisyphus happy, to believe that life is worth living, to insist that dignity and freedom and solidarity matter. In The Fall, Clement says at one point that we're all guilty and therefore no one has the right to judge anyone else. But Camus himself believed something more hopeful. Yes, we're all flawed. Yes, we all fail each other sometimes. Yes, the universe is indifferent and we're all going to die. But in the face of all that, we can still choose how we live. We can still act with integrity. We can still stand up against oppression. We can still create beauty. We can still love. We can still push the rock up the mountain knowing it will roll back down. And we can do it with dignity, with rebellion, with full consciousness, and yes, with a kind of happiness. That's the rise of Albert Camus, from poverty to becoming one of the 20th century's essential voices. And that's his Fall. The Fall, the book that acknowledges our shared guilt and failure while still insisting on our shared humanity. The rise and the fall are the same movement, the same journey, the same truth. We are Sisyphus, we are Meursault, we are Dr. Rieu, we are Clements. We are human beings living in an absurd world. And the question Camus leaves us with isn't whether life has meaning. The question is, how will you live in the face of meaninglessness? How will you rebel? What will you do with your one precious, finite, absurd life? Camus' answer is clear. Live it fully, consciously, rebelliously, and in solidarity with others. Push the rock, fight the plague, face your guilt, and imagine yourself, against all logic, happy,